Hi, everyone. This is Chris Green, and I'm the director of the Loyal Jones Appalachian Center. I'd like to welcome you to our second virtual Dinner of the Grounds of 2021, and thank goodness for springtime. Our next virtual Dinner on the Grounds will be on April 21st, just one day from Earth Day, and it will feature Greg Abernathy, Executive Director of the Kentucky Natural Lands Trust, who will be presenting Kentucky Wildlands, Biodiversity, Climate Resilience, and Just Transition. And I have a link up in the chat if you want to see the Facebook of it for that, so you can remember it. Before introducing our presenter, I'd like to let you know that when Cassie is done with her presentation, you can submit your questions and comments to the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. They're anonymous, and I will be pulling from them at the end of the talk. And we should have about 15 or 20 minutes to talk. The Appalachian Center is also interested in your experience with us today. So in the chat, we've shared a link, and I invite you to go ahead and click on the link now so you can ignore it until the end and you have time to get to it. But your experience matters to us, and we're always trying to make what we do better. Now to introducing the presentation. I want to start by dedicating our time together today to the memory and bountiful life of Cassie's mother, Wilma Chambers, who graduated from Berea with a degree in child development and would later run the college's child development lab. The depth of her patience, listening, and love uplifted family after family, and I know a lot of you are out there, and it still does. Cassie Chambers' earliest memories are of playing on her grandparents' farm in Owsley County and exploring the campus of Berea College with her mother and father. Cassie went on to graduate from Yale College, the Yale School of Public Health, London School of Economics, and Harvard Law School, where she was president of the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau, a student-run law firm that represented low-income clients. Cassie then received the Skadden Fellowship to return to Kentucky to do legal work with domestic violence survivors in rural communities. In 2018, she helped pass Jeanette's Law, which eliminated the requirement that domestic violence survivors pay an incarcerated spouse's legal fees in order to get a divorce. Cassie's book, Hill Women: Finding Family and a Way Forward in the Appalachian Mountains, was published by Random House in 2020, and she was elected to Louisville Metro Council's District 8 seat in June 2020. She's currently a professor at the University of Louisville's School of Law. And I give you Cassie Chambers. I'm hearing the applause right now in the room.
You are too kind. Thank you for that very nice introduction. And thank you so much for having me here today. It is a real honor to be with you all. I am such a big believer in Berea College. I grew up in Berea. I love Berea, and I wish that I could be there with you all in person, and look forward to sort of the other side of the pandemic when I'm able to come and visit and meet many of you all in person. And I'm so grateful to you all for spending some of your time with me this afternoon. And I hope that we can make this a conversation. I find that things I like it to be as interactive as possible. And so please drop your comments, your questions in the Q&A. There's nothing off limits. I always tell folks, being in politics and writing a memoir, it really teaches you to have thick skin. It kind of toughens you up. And so I'm happy to talk about whatever is on your all's mind, from sort of the writing process to portrayals of Appalachia in the media to how the book has been received, anything at all that's on your mind. But to start off, I want to just sort of talk about a few things that I think are important, and some lessons that I've learned in writing Hill Women and my experience writing the book, sort of thinking about Appalachia, talking about Appalachia, and thinking about my family and our journey. So the first thing I want to talk about is why I see Hill Women as being the anti-bootstraps narrative, and why I think this idea of an anti-bootstraps narrative is an important thing. So Hill Women, in a lot of ways, it's a memoir. It sort of talks about me and my life journey. And when you look at sort of the arc of my life, it looks a little bit like one of those bootstraps type narratives that we hear told so often, When I was born, both of my parents were students at Berea College. They were renting a college-owned trailer sort of on the outskirts of town. And when they brought me home from the hospital, they couldn't afford to turn on the air conditioning in that trailer because it would have made the electric bill be too high that month. And so it was sort of a childhood where there was a lot of struggle. Finances were tight. My parents used to have to save up to go to McDonald's every Sunday after church, and I would get a Happy Meal, and that was sort of our big outing every week, and our big meal out after church on Sundays. Sort of coming from that, from sort of humble beginnings, I had the opportunity to eventually go to Yale College, the Yale School of Public Health. I was a Fulbright Scholar at the London School of Economics, and I graduated from Harvard Law School. And I think so often when we tell that kind of story and we tell that kind of narrative, we tell it in this way that focuses on the individual that sort of experienced the opportunities. And in my case, it would be sort of focusing on me and my journey and the things I did to have those opportunities and seize those opportunities. I think so often that's sort of where this idea of a bootstraps narrative comes from, is someone is sort of, they come from humble beginnings, they have lots of opportunities, and it's because they put on their boots and hoisted themselves up by the bootstraps, and good on them for doing that. And in my experience, I think that that's really the wrong way to talk about progress, and to talk about family, and to talk about what it means to create opportunities, meaningful opportunities for individuals in society. And it sort of runs counter to everything I've experienced in my life, and where I think the opportunities I've had have come from. And so I'm going to sort of share a few photographs as I'm going through this next section to help sort of situate the people and the places that I really think are at the core of my story. But as sort of an overarching view, Hill Women was written to sort of complicate this bootstraps narrative, to sort of complicate this idea that when we talk about progress, we should focus on the individual, that when we tell stories of people coming from poverty, we should focus on the individual. And it was really sort of a reaction to a lot of those narratives that we hear about Appalachian. We hear about people who sort of come from poverty to have more opportunities. And an attempt to sort of complicate that narrative by talking not just about me and what I've done, but really talking about the people, the places, the social institutions, all of the things that were part of my journey and that fed into me sort of having the narrative that I've had. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen here. And I'm hoping someone will tell me if I'm not successfully sharing it, because my technology skills, even this far into the pandemic, can still be a bit suspect at times. But Hill Women starts off in Owsley County, Kentucky. And for those of you, I'm sure some of you know Owsley County, and others of you probably are less familiar with it, but Owsley County is one of the Appalachian counties in Kentucky. And it's one of the poorest counties in America by income. It has the lowest household income for a family of 4 of any county in the continental United States. It's a place that has a high rate of disability, of people with disabilities, in part because people worked really hard in sort of tobacco fields and coal mines, and their bodies suffered the consequences of that really hard labor. It's also a place where sort of social determinants of health mean that people are less healthy. There's a high rate of child poverty. There's a low workforce participation. It's sort of, when we think about what rural poverty looks like, Owsley County is one of those places that oftentimes comes to mind as sort of the quintessential image of what rural poverty looks like. Yet, in my experience, although Owsley County is certainly a place that has a lot of problems, and problems that we need to be talking about and elevating and lifting up and trying to find solutions for, it's also a place that has a lot of hope and a lot of creativity and a lot of grit and a lot of possibility. And so just as an initial matter, I think that when we're talking about struggling communities, and we're beginning to sort of tell these more complicated stories about opportunities and where they come from, it's important to think about how we balance those things, how we balance this idea of a place that has problems and a place that also has creative, gritty, hopeful people, and sort of is a place where hope dwells in abundance. And so I want to read just a little bit, a passage from the introduction of Hill Women. I promise I'm not going to read at you all too much, but I will read a few excerpts as we go through our time together today. just to sort of situate how I'm thinking about Owsley County and how I'm talking about Owsley County. And so I'm reading from the introduction here, where I am sort of rounding one of these hills that you all can see in the background of this picture, and beginning to sort of go into the holler where Owsley County is. It's hard for me to know which part of Owsley County I should show the rest of the world. Presenting the broken, falling in places helps people understand the extent of the poverty. And I do want them to know how deep it goes. Maybe if they understand it, they can help fix it. But I also don't want them to think that this poverty is all that exists in Appalachia. To see Eastern Kentucky as hopeless, broken, dirty. That's not what I see when I look at this place that I love. Some people look at this image of poverty with a sense of disgust. They see unkempt humans living in unkempt homes. Others view it with a sense of pity, those poor people trapped in such awful circumstances. I try to look at it with a sense of respect, to remember how hard they are working to survive in the overlooked corner of the world that they call home. That last view of Owsley County feels the truest to me, even if the other views fit more easily into the categories outsiders want to create. For me, there's hope in the spirit of a people who find creative ways to exist in a community that has systematically marginalized them. In men and women who take care of each other, even when the outside world does not take care of them. In people who broke their bodies in tobacco fields and coal mines to make a living in the only community they have ever known. We don't take the time to see it, the hope in the poverty, the spark against the dreary backdrop, the grit in the mountain women. And so from there, Hill Women goes on to talk a little bit about those sort of the spark, the grit in the mountain women, and the women that shaped me and the women that changed my life and provided me with all of the opportunities that I was talking to you all about at the start of our time together. And so this is a picture of my family's farm in a little holler called Cow Creek. And this is where Hill Women really begins to unfold. And Hill Women starts going back 3 generations, because I think for me, that's where every opportunity I've had starts at that point, starts with my granny. And this is a picture of my granny and my papa here. And my granny was someone who, she had a really tough life. She dropped out of school around the 3rd grade. She lived in a house that was so cold at night that her blankets would freeze because sort of the holes in the wooden boards. She never really had a childhood. And now that I'm a mother myself, I think about how different her childhood was, as I think about sort of enrichment activities for my kids and play dates and things to let them have and enjoy a childhood. I think about the fact that my granny never had any of those things, that from the time that she was able to work, she immediately began working. And she worked hard her entire life. And I love this picture of her because I think it really captures her spirit and her essence, that although she didn't have a childhood, she wasn't able to get the education that she wanted. She found a lot of joy in her day-to-day life. And you can see the intensity with which she is kissing my papa here. That was who she was. She was someone who loved intensely, who loved her family intensely, who danced as she sort of cleaned her house and played Ralph Stanley, for those of you who out there who are Stanley Brothers fans, played music and just really embraced and loved life to the fullest. And although she didn't have the opportunity to get an education for herself, somehow she had come to understand that education was an important tool. And I think a lot about where that came from, how she was able to wrap her mind around the importance of education when it was something so far outside of her experience and outside the experience of her community at that time. Most people didn't graduate high school, let alone sort of go to college, sort of leave the holler that their family was in. Family was so important. And I want to be clear that I think family and sort of community is still important. I think people make legitimate choices to value those things and stay in the area that they're from. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on, but I just want to say up front that I think that those are certainly legitimate choices people can make. But somehow in all of this, my granny decided that she wanted to have a child. She wanted all of her children to be able to get an education because she understood that it was this tool. And sort of one by one, she wasn't able to actualize on her dream. She wasn't able to make it happen. She had 7 children, and one after the other, they each had to leave high school, drop out, help out on the family farm. A lot of times they sort of, her children would tell her that they felt a sense of shame of going to school because even though they lived in this poor area, they were one of the poorer families and they got made fun of for wearing the same clothes every day. A lot of times they would get into fights because those of you from Eastern Kentucky know the sort of honor of your family, the pride of your family is an important thing. And when other children would tease them about sort of wearing the same clothes and not having any money to sort of go to the store with, they would feel like they had to defend their family's honor, and they ended up getting into a lot of fights at school. And so eventually, one after the other, for a series of reasons, all of Granny's first 5 children dropped out of school and went to work on the family farm. But my mother, and she's pictured here, was the 6th of Granny's children and the first to be able to graduate from high school. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about why that was the case, why she was able to sort of get an education where the others weren't. And I think in some ways it was because as a female child, she spent more time with Granny sort of working in the house. And so her influence over her was a bit stronger, and sort of Granny talking to her about education at all, sort of from the time she was little onward, really stuck with her and really made her value education, and really made her committed to being able to graduate high school. And not only did she graduate high school, my mom was the first in her family to go to college, and she went to Berea College. And I remember her talking to me often about how Berea changed her life and changed her really her understanding of the world. She would tell me how when she first moved into her dormitory, she was terrified to go outside because she'd come from this very, very small town. She hadn't had a lot of experience with the outside world. And she was just convinced that if she left her dormitory, she would never find her way back, that she would get lost. And she was even afraid to go to the cafeteria to get food because she thought she would never find her way back to where she was supposed to be. But Berea College changed her, and it opened her horizons so much that whenever I was born, sort of when she was a sophomore, after her sophomore year, she raised me to understand that education is the tool that opens your horizons as wide as you want them to be, that there is nothing that education can't do for you. And for her, coming from that holler in Owsley County, where people didn't leave, where education wasn't sort of part of the everyday experience, the jump that she had made to be able to go to Berea was so great and so vast that she raised me to believe that there was nothing that I couldn't do. And so that's a big part of where my opportunities came from, is my mom making this choice to do this hard thing that Granny had sort of built the foundation for her to be able to do and started to instill the value of in her. My mom's decision to go to Berea opened her horizons, and in turn opened my horizons, and really sort of made her instill in me the importance of education and how it was a tool for opening doors to whatever you wanted to do in life. I also want to spend some time talking about my Aunt Ruth, pictured here. My Aunt Ruth was one of Granny's older children, the only other daughter in the family. And my Aunt Ruth didn't have the opportunity to finish high school. She had gotten so close, but she got rheumatic fever whenever she was in high school and fell behind, and the family needed her to help out on the farm. And just a cascade of events meant that she never had the opportunity to finish her education. And so my Aunt Ruth went to work in the tobacco fields, like so many people in Owsley County did. And she took pride in being the best sort of worker in all of Owsley County. She used to get hired over all the young men in town because she could cut more tobacco stalks per hour than anyone else in all of Owsley County. And so she took pride in achieving in the way she could. She hadn't been able to get an education, but she was going to be the hardest worker that Owsley County had ever seen. And I love this picture of her because it sort of embodies who she was. She had sort of cut her hair short to keep it from matting against her neck when she was working in the tobacco fields. And she worked hard every single day to sort of help support the family farm. And yet in her free time, she grew wildflowers in a little patch in the yard of the house because she loved things that were beautiful. And this is a picture of her with her wildflower patch whenever she was sort of young and still helping to support the family on the farm. And I mention Aunt Ruth because she's a pivotal person in my life and in my story as well. My Aunt Ruth was the person that sort of convinced my mom to actually get in the truck and go to college and make that drive that was really only an hour or so away, but felt like an entirely different world for my mother. Aunt Ruth was the person that said, I didn't get the chance to go to school, and so you're going to college because I didn't get to, and I don't want to hear any arguing. And here's the money that I have saved up from mowing lawns and cutting tobacco, and I don't want to hear any complaints about it. You're going to take this money and you're going to go to college, and you're doing it for all of us. And so whenever I start thinking about the things that gave me the opportunities that I had, Aunt Ruth is a part of that. The fact that she sort of sacrificed in terms of giving up on her dreams to support the family so that my mom could have the opportunity to go to Berea, that she took her money and gave it to her sister and said, you're going, and stop arguing. I'm your big sister. I'll sort of put you in the truck myself if I have to. And so I think that so often when we tell these stories, again, we don't focus on sort of everything that happened to build up to the point that one person has an opportunity. And I think it's important that we start to talk about the family members, the generations that came before, other people's choices. For me, also sort of different programs, government support, policy systems, I think are also a part of the story. When I was growing up, we got food stamps for a while. We were on Medicaid for a while. And so all of these things, the way that community, the way that family, the way that policy structures come together to provide opportunities, I think is important. And I think too often we don't talk about it. It's harder to talk about sort of the complicated anti-bootstraps narrative of it all. But that's all sort of what led to me having opportunities that I did. And so here is a picture of me on that same farm in Owsley County when I was a child. My mom made the tough choice to finish her education after I was born, which I admire. And now that I have two young kids myself, I admire even more because I understand exactly how difficult it is to do much of anything really whenever you have young kids. But it shaped me, being able to watch her study and learn. And I remember walking with a babysitter to be there to meet her whenever she would get out of classes when I was a child. And that experience sort of seeped into my core and very much influenced the way that I saw the world and the way that I thought about education and so many other things. And this is a picture you can see, that's Aunt Ruth there behind me as I'm sort of running on the farm in my childhood. And another way that Aunt Ruth is a part of the story is she continued to be a support for my mom and for me as I grew up, because my mom, when she had finals, when she had midterms, when she had a lot of reading, she was young and trying to finish her education because that's what was going to move our family forward. And so Aunt Ruth and Granny and her family continued to play a supportive role as I sort of grew up, and my mom juggled being a young mom and a wife and a college student. So I'm going to stop sharing photos and sort of take it from here, but without the PowerPoint. Hopefully someone will let me know if my technology has failed me. But so the next thing I want to talk about, sort of, moving from this idea of the anti-bootstraps narrative and this idea of talking about family, talking about social systems, talking about all the complicating factors that lead to progress, is this idea that sort of the stories we tell matter. And so the reason that I wanted to start telling this anti-bootstrap story, sort of telling my narrative, was in response to the way that I felt like other stories about Appalachia overly simplified. narratives that looked very similar to mine. And so I can just call it out for what it is. In 2016, there was a book called Hillbilly Elegy that I'm guessing a lot of you all might have experience with, and a lot of you all might have read. And on the outside, that story looks kind of similar to mine. It was someone who sort of had Appalachian ties in their background, was sort of born into poverty, and then went on to have these experiences at elite educational institutions. However, I sort of looked at this narrative. I looked at Hillbilly Elegy. I looked at all of the other narratives that were becoming so popular about Appalachia around that time. And I realized that although the arc of our stories looked the same, the sort of meaning that I ascribed to it was very different, because again, I didn't see it as sort of being a story that was focused on me. I saw it as a story that was focused on the generations that came before me. And also, I thought that the way that we were talking about struggling communities mattered, and that whereas some of those narratives were focused on sort of moral failings of individuals, I really thought that we needed to be talking more about moral failings of policy systems. And so I will say, I didn't know that I really had a story worth telling until I sort of saw Hillbilly Elegy. I saw the way that people were reacting to it. I saw just how many people were interested in reading it, and how that became all that a lot of people knew about Appalachia. And so I felt sort of compelled to tell my story as a counterpoint to that, and as a different way of thinking about it. I think so often that when we tell these stories about struggling communities, be they in Appalachia or in other places, we sort of talk about them in a way that is othering, and we make it sound as though these communities don't have the ability to sort of solve their own problems. And I think we do this with marginalized communities wherever they are, wherever they're from, be it if we're talking about Black communities in Louisville that have typically been sort of underinvested in, or we're talking about the Appalachian region. So often we sort of talk about poverty, and we don't talk about the fact that there are sort of people on the ground working on these problems. And the fact that the problems haven't been solved isn't because the people there aren't smart enough, or they're not doing good enough work to try to solve them. It's because they don't have the resources, and the systems haven't sort of been aligning for them over time, and that those are intentional policy choices that we've made. And so one of the things that I hope to do by telling the stories of the creative, gritty women that shaped me was to sort of remind people that there's a lot of creativity and hope and possibility in Appalachian communities, and that the stories of the women there haven't been told enough. And if we start to tell those stories, hopefully people will realize what we need to be doing is supporting the hardworking leaders that exist on the ground in these communities, and giving them the tools to elevate their communities and solve the problems that they have. And so I do think that the stories we tell about struggling communities matter. I think everyone has a story worth telling. I think stories are how the world changes. And I think we have to be cognizant of what types of voices that we are lifting up in struggling communities. The last thing I really want to sort of touch on is this idea of stories being the way that the world changes. And to do that, I want to talk a little bit about what sort of happened after I graduated from Harvard Law School, and sort of the way that I came to terms with thinking about family, thinking about community, thinking about where I came from, and what had shaped me. And so for me, when I was in law school, that was when I started to understand the way that my granny, my Aunt Ruth, my mom had sacrificed and worked hard, and sort of given me the things that I had and the opportunities I had. And for me, I believe that whenever you come to that understanding, that you are sort of the product of your community, or the product of other people's choices to lift you up and support you, you're morally compelled to sort of pay those opportunities forward. And so after I graduated from Harvard Law School, I returned to Kentucky and began working with low-income domestic violence survivors in rural Kentucky communities. And I like to describe myself as a one-woman traveling law firm in those days. I had a printer and a Wi-Fi stick in the back of my car, and I drove over an 8-county service area representing low-income domestic violence survivors in family court. I met with clients at gas stations. I met with clients at libraries. It was sort of trying to find ways to provide legal services to a whole bunch of people that needed them. A lot of people don't realize that for civil law matters such as divorces, custody cases, protective orders, which is what I did, you're not guaranteed an attorney. And legal aid services are the way that you can get an attorney. But I was the only free family law attorney for an entire 8-county service area. And so sort of the wild, wild west of legal practice. And I will say I came to understand a lot of the shortcomings of our court system during my time doing that. And that's part of what has led me to be a law professor now and teach about access to justice, is realizing the ways that not having an attorney sort of changes the outcome of your case. The ways that accessing the court system, which is a branch of government that you have to pay to utilize, sort of the ways that that system could be set up better, the ways that that system makes it hard for folks without a lot of money to really be able to make their government, make this particular branch of government work for them. And so in my time with legal aid and doing that kind of work, that's really when I began to understand the importance of stories. I think a good lawyer is a good storyteller. I think that if you can sort of tell the story of someone and why they need a particular type of legal relief, that's sort of how you get a good outcome. And I think for most things, when you're seeking some kind of change or some sort of decision, that storytelling is so important. The way you tell the story is so important. And I want to spend just a few minutes talking a little bit about my experience with Jeanette, because I think it illustrates the power of stories. So Jeanette was a client of mine that I met who had suffered sort of years of physical abuse. Right before she came to me, her husband had physically assaulted her, sort of raised a loaded gun, fired it at her, and the bullet had ripped through her clothing, and to the point that there was a bullet hole in her shirt, and her shirt was in police custody for a long time. And after that sort of assault, and also that time her husband had sort of crossed a line and assaulted their child. And for her, that was she was like, now it's time for me to leave. I'm ready to move on with my life. And so she came to me trying to get a divorce, trying to get a protective order. And it was my job to sort of steer her through that process. And there was a quirk in Kentucky law at the time that although Jeanette came to me because she couldn't afford an attorney, that was the definition of why I was representing her for free through this legal aid program. There was a quirk in Kentucky law that required her to pay for her now incarcerated husband to have an attorney. And I want to be clear, I think requiring folks to have an attorney is a good thing. I think legal representation is important. But the problem was who had to pay for that attorney. And in this case, it was Jeanette. It was the person who had sort of suffered this horrific violence for years, who was being forced to pay for an attorney for the person who had perpetrated that violence, although she couldn't afford an attorney for herself. And it made her feel as though the system was designed to work for him and not for her. It made her feel as though the system was unjust. It made her feel re-victimized. And so Jeanette and I decided together to change the law. And at first, Jeanette wasn't sure sort of how involved in this process that she wanted to be. But as it sort of started moving, and as there was a bill introduced, and as lawmakers started to get interested in this problem, Jeanette started to speak out about her personal experience and about her story. And she went and she told her story to every media outlet, every newspaper, every reporter that was interested in it. She talked about really personal, vulnerable things. She showed pictures of her bruises from assaults, and they were broadcast on the nightly news. But she used her voice to make this issue a story, and sort of seeing the power of that. Once she started doing that, it was just a matter of weeks before a bill that sort of bore her name, that was called Jeanette's Law, sailed through both houses of the Kentucky state legislature and was signed into law. And those of us who have been following the session this year or any year know that it's really hard to get bills to move and to get them to sort of become law. And the fact that hers moved so quickly it didn't take years, it took weeks, I think is a testament to the power of what happens when someone tells their story. And so I would encourage everyone who's tuning in and listening to think about what your story is. What's the story that you can tell that can make something better? What's the story you can tell that could change something and help someone else? I think we all have that story in us, but figuring out what it is and how to tell it is sort of the challenge. And I'd be happy to have conversations with anyone who wants to sort of brainstorm around that. So I'm going to read just a quick passage about Jeanette and Jeanette's law. And this is sort of after her bill, her law had passed and been sort of signed and was official. And it's talking about how, although this was a win, there's still sort of more work to be done. But each small win is just that, a win. And each win is a reminder that things can change. These wins are also a reminder that people who have been victimized, be it by a spouse or by an unjust system, are nonetheless powerful. Some people portray survivors of domestic violence as weak. Some people portray the women in Appalachia the same way. I think Jeanette's story illustrates the opposite. When given the right tools, support, and environment, these women are capable of changing the world. And so the last thing that I want to say before I sort of open it up for questions, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from all of you all, it is to talk a little bit about my takeaways from telling my story, because I've just told you all that I think everyone has a story to tell, and I think it's really important that we all tell our stories. And so what have I learned from telling mine, from sort of thinking about these generations and these women and all of these complicated things and what it means to have opportunities and to be a part of a family and a community. I will tell you, I thought that when I started writing Hill Women, that I was going to come out of it sort of understanding the problems of Appalachia and being an expert on them, and that I was going to interview family members and read social science reports and be able to sort of lay out my 5-point policy plan for the future of Appalachia. And sort of and distill really the meaning that I thought that my story had. And I'll tell you, in some ways, I've come out of it seeing things as even more complicated than when I first started. And so the thing that I'm going to end with is just a really short passage from the end of the book, sort of reflecting on this idea of what are the takeaways that I have about Appalachia and I have about telling my story. And then I'm very much looking forward to hearing your questions. But this book is now complete, and I don't have all the answers I'd hoped to. I still struggle with how to balance the many delicate and competing concerns. Talking about the problems Appalachia faces while highlighting its strengths. Recognizing the importance of tradition while still supporting innovative change. Encouraging community-driven solutions, along with bringing outside resources to the region. I wish I had more solid conclusions to share, but in the end, it's the complexities of Appalachia and the people that live here that needs sharing the most. Today, more than ever, I'm glad I've told these stories. I hope they have shown people the surprising nuances of the region and its problems, so often reduced to a singular stereotype. I hope they have made voices from the mountains ring louder and helped people see the potential that exists here. I hope they bring attention to an area that we often allow ourselves to overlook. The people here deserve that. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking at you all, and I look forward to hearing any questions, comments, reflections, thoughts that you all might have.
Cassie, I'm applauding. I imagine everybody out there is too. I can feel their energies coming in. What I will share before we get to questions is that Cassie has decided to forego the honorarium for this. And so we're going to be able to buy books for 30 Berea students. So if you all out there, because I saw so many staff and faculty, if you know those students who need that book, just email me or Heather Dent, and we'll see that they get a copy of that book in their CPO. So thank you for that, Cassie. You didn't know we were going to be able to do that.
Thank you. That's really nice. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to know that you're able to do that.
So here's the first question. And this comes from Vance Blade. And it says, as it relates to poverty and crime in Louisville and other urban areas, what are your thoughts about a resolution? Talk about complex problems. But here you are, you have the wand. What would you do?
Sort of to resolve some of the problems in Louisville. I gotta shift my mind. I feel like so often I sort of inhabit two worlds now. One world, I talk a lot about rural communities and the unique struggles of rural communities, and I talk a lot about Owsley County and Boonville. And then my other sort of world that I inhabit is now I live in one of the most urban areas of the state, and I'm an elected representative representing the Highlands area of Louisville, which is very dense and very urban. And so a lot of times I'm sort of living with one foot in the world of rural poverty and one foot in the world of urban poverty. And it's interesting because I think that they are equally as important to solve. They require sort of equal investment of resources. I think so often we see them as competing with one another, that you can only invest in one or you can only invest in the other. And the way that I think about sort of the unique challenges of each is different. You know, in rural areas, it's really hard to get services out to folks. Just sort of when I was at the Louisville Legal Aid Society, I was based in Louisville and I was responsible for this 8-county area. And so sort of driving from county to county to county to county, I would have a 2.5-hour drive to make it from the bottom of the service area up to the top. And so it's just harder to sort of have resources and push those out versus in urban areas. It's sort of, they're more concentrated. And I will tell you, in terms of the specific issues of sort of violence and, you know, Louisville has seen sort of record violence in the past year, and it's continuing this year. And we've been having a lot of conversations that make me hopeful about this idea of investing in upstream interventions, and the idea that if you focus on making communities safe and healthy, providing people with opportunities, sort of looking at the opportunities to intervene, particularly with youth, whenever there's sort of a first, they start to get a little disconnected, sort of those interventions to pull them back in and help them get into the workforce or continue with their education. And so I think increasingly as we think about, you know, we know that sort of studies show us that the single biggest factor that's tied to violent crime is poverty. And so if we can think about those sort of solutions to really address the needs of a community, create these upstream interventions, I think that that's one way that we can sort of tackle that problem. It's a really multifaceted problem.
Thank you for that answer. Very thoughtful with it. Our next question is from an anonymous attendee. They say, so great, thank you. I love that you center these conversations around women. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the strength of how the strength of Hill women intersects with gardening, cooking, farming, etc.
That's an interesting question. You know, I think so often that the women in Appalachia, there's always been this idea that there's sort of power concentrated in the private sphere. And so when you say sort of cooking and gardening, it makes me think of that sort of private sphere power that my granny was running the show, although my papa was the one who sort of was in town and talking to people, talking about politics. My granny was the one that was running the show and sort of saying, you know, this is how we're going to do things. But it was very, it was very sort of private sphere focused. And one thing that I've been able to sort of work on and work with a lot of women on is increasingly, we know that women in all communities are underrepresented in sort of public facing decision-making roles. And so it's something that I see in Eastern Kentucky too. Increasingly, we have these women who are sort of stepping forward into public sphere leadership roles and running for elected office and starting small businesses and sort of stepping into those public facing roles. And so I think historically, there's always been a recognition that, you know, women from the mountains are strong-willed, sort of take care of their families, take care of other people's families, really are the ones that hold their communities together. And it's been really wonderful to see how increasingly that's sort of translated into political power and to people stepping forward into public decision-making roles.
It is really remarkable and heartening to see. It truly, truly is. Here's another great question. Amongst all the placelessness of modern life today, can you even begin to speculate how your life might be different had it not been rooted in Owsley County?
I feel like I spend a lot of time thinking about that. I think about, how easy it would have been for my mom not to go to Berea, how easy it would have been for her after she had me not to finish her degree at Berea, how formative Berea as an institution was for my whole family. I mean, my mom eventually went and worked at Berea for a number of years and eventually was the director of the Child Development Center there. And I think how that sort of, I think in many ways it was her living out her experience for other families, that she had sort of come to Berea, studied child development while she was raising me, had sort of seen how that there were synergies there, and then sort of continued to do that work for other families. And so I think a lot about those sort of happenstance things that happen in our lives, how different if she had sort of made a different decision, if my granny had made a different decision, if I'd made a different decision. And I think that's why I feel so grateful. And I feel like I owe so much to the people that came before me, because, my mom and my granny and my Aunt Ruth did hard things, and they did them not for themselves. They did them for me and for the generations that would come after them. And I think that that's such an important thing for all of us to take to heart and internalize, is that when we think about our own lives and the choices we make, we should do hard things, not just because they're going to help us or the people we know now, but because they're going to help our community in the future.
One of the things I hear you sharing there is that this is something that we see across the nation, in urban areas and rural areas. And it's about people's intentionality and commitment to each other to enable those roots to grow. And you just happen to have a really beautiful place in Owsley County where that happened. Our next question. Thank you for sharing the anti-bootstraps narrative. What are some other untold Appalachian narratives that you would like to read about?
So one thing that I really like to elevate, and I would love to hear stories about this, is I just think that there's such a diversity of perspectives in Appalachia. And so often what the outside world reads is sort of the singular stereotype narrative. And I think reminding folks that, there are people of color in Appalachia, there are LGBTQ individuals, there are people with disabilities, the sort of the diversity and range of experience that we see in all of our communities exist in Appalachia, and sort of elevating those perspectives and those voices is so important. And I think women's voices have historically been very sort of muted or sort of stereotyped in the way that they're portrayed. You either sort of have the granny type literature figure who is just so selfless and is not a fully rounded person, because they're just so selfless and self-sacrificing that it's not really an accurate portrayal of what a person is, or you have sort of these different buckets that we put female voices into. And so I think elevating voices that fall outside of those buckets is really important. And that's sort of the thing I'm thinking about now, is this idea of a Hill Women Voices project. As I've put this book out into the world, it's been amazing to me how many people come up to me and they say, I loved your book. It resonated with me. My goodness, your Aunt Ruth's wonderful. Let me tell you about, my Aunt Carol or my grandma or my mom. And it's always, my mom was the first to go to medical school and then she did this, or I knew someone who started a business and this happened. And there are incredible stories of women who have made a difference in their communities. And so I think it's been really inspiring to realize how many of them there are out there and how many stories there are to tell. And so I think finding a way to empower folks to tell those stories, to create a space where they can talk about the transformative power of the women in their lives that have lifted them up, I think would be a really cool project to work on. And so I'm thinking right now about how to create that kind of space.
Now you've got my brain burbling too, thinking about oral history projects, thinking about the National Story Project that comes through NPR, thinking about the Appalachian Women's Project. Oh, so much.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really important, so often people have their stories, but you don't hook them into the larger framework. And whenever you start sort of talking about, okay, who are the Hill women that we collectively know, it's sort of seeing all of those stories come together is such an incredible and powerful thing.
Well, the next question gets to this, and it's one thing if you had told your story, right? If you began writing it and you had it published, let's say with a tiny publisher, but you happen to have it with, Random House, a big place. So the person wants to know, well, how did that go about happening?
Yeah, I get a lot of people that ask me, what advice do you have for publishing a book? And I have to tell them, I don't know how to get a book published because mine sort of happened in such a roundabout way. And again, I think the takeaway is the importance of sort of women helping women, people sort of elevating stories that are like their own. But I remember I was having lunch with someone who was in Louisville just for a year. They had sort of been connected to TV and whatnot, and they were living in Louisville for a year. And we had both just read Hillbilly Elegy, and I was complaining, what an awful narrative. Oh, I didn't enjoy reading this at all. And she said, well, why don't you just write your own book then? And I said, haha, sure thing. I'm going to write a book. I never thought that I would be someone to write a book. I always had loved writing, but it seemed like writing a book was a hard thing. And I hadn't yet sort of realized that I had a story that people might be interested in. But she connected me with an agent, a young woman from a background similar to mine, who in turn connected me with an editor who was also from a rural community and also believed in the importance of elevating rural stories. In this case, rural stories from North Dakota, very different than rural stories in Appalachia, but there were so many commonalities in our story that she felt really strongly about. And again, I think that's so important to sort of connect and find commonalities with other communities that have been marginalized and other communities that have struggled, because I do think so often we sort of see them as at odds when instead we should be sort of building together. And I tell everyone that I think having an editor that you really like is so important when you're writing a book like this, because it's going to be almost like a therapist who's in your ear the whole time, sort of saying, no, let's dig deeper. No, let's get more emotion. No, tell me, really, I want you to reflect on this and rewrite this and give me some more deep digging about your thoughts in this moment. And so I worked with this incredible team of sort of 30 something women to create this book and put it out into the world. And it was really cool. Whenever it did come out pre-COVID, my editor and the agent and sort of the team of women all came down, and we went to Owsley County, and we got to spend some time with Aunt Ruth and sort of see the family farm, which is now, the house is almost dilapidated, but we sort of traipsed around and checked things out. And it was a really cool experience to be able to share with the team.
Well, as a writer and knowing lots of writers and helping them be published, to hear that story gives me hope for New York too.
Yeah, I think I'm realizing that if you find people that sort of have similar backgrounds, have similar stories, want to elevate similar voices, that's really helpful in getting your story out into the world.
So the next question, I generally don't share who the person is until I release it, but this is from our president, Lyle Ruloffs. What writers from about Appalachia have influenced you most? Whose messages and themes seem to be most important?
Ooh, I love that question. And I will say it's always hard for me to sort of pick. The Appalachian writers community has been just so incredible at sort of welcoming me in. And I didn't even realize there was this community. But the other day I did a panel with Silas House. I'm guessing some of you all know him, and Lee Smith, sort of the godmother of Appalachian literature in a lot of ways. And it just blew my mind that they had both read Hill Women and had nice things to say about it. And so I think what has been really cool for me is sort of seeing how the story that I have told fits in with all of these people who have been telling stories for a long time. And of course, I just think Silas has done so many things for the way that the outside world knows about Appalachian, thinks about Appalachian. So it was a very surreal moment for me to be able to sit on a panel and hear them say that they had read Hill Women. And for all of you all who have taken time to read Hill Women, it really is a huge honor anytime anyone spends the time to read the book, because it hadn't really occurred to me until about a week before it came out that people would actually read it. And I know that there's so many ways to spend your time. And so I feel like when someone takes the time to read Hill Women, it's sort of them taking the time to sit down and have a conversation with me. And so for those of you who have read it, thank you, thank you, thank you. It really means the world to me.
We're about 5 minutes away from 1 o'clock, and I see people are leaving. So I'll just remind people to go ahead and click that link so you can tell us how this went, and we can figure out what you learned. And we've got about 38 questions, Cassie, which is great, which means there's a lot of resonance. And I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to them all, but we'll go as far as we can. The next one says, thank you so much for sharing all this. I loved reading your book. I was wondering what kind of opportunities you've had to challenge on a national stage the bootstraps narrative, and J.D. Vance in particular. Are you hopeful that the national narrative focus will shift to your kind of focus over the other? What has your experience since the publication of your book been like in this respect?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. And I will say any questions I don't get to, I'm happy. My email is just cassie.h.chambers@gmail.com. You can send me your questions. You can tell me that you want to talk about writing. I'm happy to chat with anyone at any time. And hopefully you all can push out that information to anyone who's interested as well. So I wrote a piece in The Atlantic when J.D. Vance's movie came out that basically talked about how it's important to the types of stories that we tell about struggling communities, and focusing on the stories that make it seem as though there are moral failings of people instead of moral failings of systems driving a lot of the struggles, that those aren't the stories that we should be elevating and sort of talking about. While I think everyone has a right to tell their story, sort of the moment that you cross over from telling a particular story to making a particular story be the narrative for a region, and talking about it from a sort of policy and political standpoint is when it's sort of fair to criticize that. And I will tell you, I have never gotten more angry emails in my inbox than when I sort of talked about my personal issues with Hillbilly Elegy in The Atlantic. I think a lot of people feel very strongly because stories, people connect with them. And so people that had connected with his story, and some of you all might have connected with his story, sort of feel like, how could you attack that story? How could you sort of say one type of story is better than another? And I think it's just a good reminder that we all feel so motivated by the stories that we hear. It's also a good reminder that writers, it'll give you tough skin. I'm telling you, sometimes people, they sit and they write really long emails, and you're like, oh, you really didn't like what I wrote at all. But I will say overall, the experience of putting the book out into the world has just been incredible, and I feel so lucky. One of the last events I got to do pre-COVID was a book launch event in Lexington. And for me, the entire point of writing this story was to elevate the voices of women from the mountains and tell more complicated stories and change the narrative. And I wanted people like my mom, like my granny, like my Aunt Ruth to feel proud of this book. And I knew my Aunt Ruth felt proud because she'll sometimes call me and she'll say, I talked to Melinda and she says, I'm the hero of your book. And, she's not a prideful woman, but I can tell how proud she is in those moments. But at that event, it was at Joseph Beth in Lexington. I don't know a lot of people in Lexington. I was wondering if anyone would show up. And 15 minutes even before the talk started, the room was just jam-packed with a lot of Berea people, a lot of people who had driven from mountain communities because they had read Hill Women and they felt like it represented them and it represented their family. And they just wanted to give me a hug and have me sign their books. And it was one of the most touching, moving experiences, was sort of seeing how those women, which that was who I was trying to reach, how they felt heard and they felt connected to the book. And so I always love hearing from people that the book resonates with, and happy to talk to anyone who sort of feels like it touches on their story, or they want to sort of connect. Like I said, I always love hearing from people who have read it and have a story of their own to share.
Well, our time is at the end. And Cassie, I want to thank you for sharing your story. right? And inviting other people to share theirs and helping us to see in those stories that we share these resources of making the world happen, and those resources are each other. And these questions that people have asked have all gotten to that. And I wish you the best of luck in continuing to go ride the wonderful surfboard that is your book into more talks, and to keep gathering those stories as well.
Thank you. And thanks so much for having me. It's been really great to be with you all.
Thanks.